Hey YouTube, Kevin Clear here with a knife video for you. Today I have a pretty cool blade. This is the Lansky Responder X9. So the X9 is one of three blades that Lansky put out as sort of their first effort at entering the knife market rather than, they're actually a sharpening company. They make sharpening and sharpening tools and all kinds of different sharpening systems. Stones obviously, but then they have other things as well. Anyway, they didn't make knives up until last year, and so last year this knife, one version, the same knife, only smaller, the X7 and the Lansky World Legal were all released. And they're all pretty cool blades, and certainly doing something very different. And there's a couple things that I appreciate about these knives. The first one is they're very budget friendly, and this one is a very large knife, as you can kind of see as I'm holding it here, but for a knife as large as this and in actually pretty good materials, you're only looking at maybe 35 bucks or something like that. Not only is the price point very attractive, but it's designed by Mikkel Williamson, which means it's a really cool and really different design. If you're looking at that $35 price point, you're going to see a lot of the same things, okay? Typical, very standard drop point or clip point blades, black G10, liner locks, okay? But here you're getting a bunch of different stuff that you don't normally see in that sort of budget market, okay? I'll talk specifically about some of the things that this knife has that we're not used to seeing, but for now, it's neat to be able to get a knife that's kind of different, that's designed by a designer that's popular, and get that at a very, very attractive price point. Okay, so that's the main reason that I like this knife. I like things that are different, and I like things that are maybe offering something that other companies, other knives at a similar price are not offering. Okay, so having said that, let's go on and talk about size and weight on this, because that's one of the things that really stands out. If you want a large knife, if you are doing something, you have some regular activity that requires something big, this is a good option, and it's offered at a very attractive price point. So size and weight on this, it's 9 inches overall, 3 3/4 inch blade, 5 1/4 inch handle. It is canted, right? So you can see how the measurements are a little awkward because it's like you sort of have to make a triangle, right? You got this distance and that distance, but it's pretty cool. Now, one of the things that's worth noticing is how thick this knife is. It's comparable certainly to a lot of Spydercos where you've got a pretty wide blade or a pretty wide package when it's folded up, and add to that, it's fairly heavy and the handle is fairly thick, and you have one of the larger knives in my collection in terms of how much real estate it takes up in your pocket. Okay, so you've got nearly 2 inches here, and if you add the flipper, you have a good 2 inches there. I carry, of course, tip up, as many of you prefer as well. Plus, you have a little added length here because of this glass breaker or skull crusher or impact device, whatever you want to call it. So you do have a very large knife, okay? It takes up a considerable amount of space, and for that reason it may not be the most practical EDC. In addition to those numbers I gave you, so again, 3 3/4, 5 1/4, 9 inches overall, this weighs in at 8.6 ounces. So by the way, 8.6 ounces, if you're really needing a large knife, that's the same weight as the large Espada. Okay, so obviously the large Espada is a huge knife, and I want to show you some sort of competitive options at this point because I want you to understand how heavy that is. So here, now obviously it's not quite as long, is the Zero Tolerance 0200. This is a great knife, one of my favorites. I would recommend this to anyone. But there you go. In terms of size comparison, you can see that you have a smaller blade and about 1.5 ounces lighter. This lands around 7 ounces. Okay, here you have another blade, again around 7 ounces. This is the CRKT Crawford Casper. Now this is an even more budget-friendly offering. Now the steel, I would say, is not as good, nor is the handle material. However, you do have a large sort of tactical liner lock knife, and this knife weighs, again, about 7 ounces, so considerably less. It is closer in size, okay? So that's probably worth considering. Finally, one other option that if you really need a large knife, but size and weight is a concern, this knife is the Cold Steel Holdout, and it is around the same, almost 9 inches, 8 3/4 inches, but it only weighs like 5 ounces, 4 point something ounces in fact, to get it exactly right. So very lightweight, although you're getting a ton of blade and a ton of functionality. So those are, you know, not only competitive options. The price range does vary on all of those, as you know. The Cold Steel is like a little bit more than the Lansky, and the ZT is a lot more than the Lansky, and then this guy is even cheaper than the Lansky. But they are all, you know, sort of large folding knives, and so if you need a large folding knife, I think those are all fair options or fair comparisons to make to this guy. We will talk about the features that this has and why the price point is still pretty good for that. And the first one is the blade. So the blade here is, again, 3 3/4 inches, very thick blade stock. It is a rather abrupt hollow grind. Now see how thick this blade is? Even if they had taken the hollow grind up to this point, this would be, I would say, that would be an improvement, because, let me zoom in for this part so you can kind of see what I'm talking about here. And of course my remote doesn't want to work right. There we go. So you can see you've got a lot of blade steel, but the grind does not come up. There's a large flat portion. Now that is cool in terms of looks, because you can see that they stone wash this and then polish the flats, which I like, and I actually do that a lot whenever I, you know, all the cold steels that I've stripped, I always do that. But because of that design feature, you end up with an extremely sharp angle. Okay, so as you're cutting into something, you know, let's pretend you're cutting into my hand and the material has to open up this way. Well, you've got it's got a really strong wedge effect because of the fact that this hollow grind is only over a short distance. Okay, so you've got just a short distance here where you can achieve your grind. Now the edge is fairly thin, and I have done some cutting with it, and it slices pretty well because of that thin edge geometry. But you just have to know, for example, I cut up a pineapple, and it was a bit of a challenge because, man, you're very quickly getting into a lot of blade pushing through that material. Other things, if you're just cutting a piece of rope or you're cutting cardboard or anything like that, you're not going to notice it quite as much. Now, one other thing that should be noticed is, I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit and I'll come back to the blade, but because this handle is large and thick, and because of that canted shape of everything in terms of the blade to the handle, you do have a lot of leverage, so you can really bear down and push this through things. So it sort of balances out the poor grind plan, okay? And so, you know, we're going to say this grind is not great slicing geometry, but partially that's made up for by a large handle that allows you to push really hard. It'd be nice if you didn't have to push that hard, but you can because of the handle design. I know we're not on the handle yet, we'll talk more about that in a second. There is this large cutout which somewhat reduces weight, although you guys still know this is a stinking heavy knife. You have a small swedge on top, and of course your hollow grind here. Now there's a lot of belly in this knife. There's only about this much flat portion here. And so there's a lot of belly, which again, it makes it good for slicing. By the way, this knife claims a combat design. They call it the Williamson Urban Tactical. So, you know, you guys know I'm not a fan of that term tactical. It seems like anything can be called tactical. But the knife is claiming for itself that it's designed for combat. Okay, we will make one comment about that as we get into lockup and deployment. But the blade shape is reasonable, and the reality is any blade shape is going to function decently well in a combat role, because frankly, if all you need is a piece of metal that you can jab at someone, you could sharpen a piece of rebar and it's going to be fairly effective. Okay, so kind of keep that in the back of your mind when they claim tactical. One of the things they do like to do is carry a lot of blade width to the tip, and so this is good. It doesn't start kind of narrowing down until about here with that sort of modified clip point / drop point, and I guess because of that, you know, you are going to get a certain amount of penetrating power. And so it's a good combination of slicing and penetrating which is what you often see in a combat designed blade. Now, so that's the blade. It is 12C27 Sandvik, which is so-so blade steel. Maybe a step up from 8CR13 MOV, but certainly not as good as AUS 8, certainly not anywhere near as good as 14C28N, which is a fantastic steel. But of course, no one else but Kershaw is going to be using that steel. So yeah, it's kind of middle of the road. It's going to be easy to resharpen. It's going to hold an edge decently well. You know, not out of line for a budget steel, okay? It's going to be fine for a budget steel. So that's everything pretty well that I need to tell you about the blade. Let's talk about lockup, and we're zoomed in here already so you can see this is a liner lock. I want to show you a couple other liner locks. Here's the 0 tolerance 0200. Look how much thicker that is. That's one of the things that I would complain about this. I would like to see a thicker liner. Now here's another knife, and this knife is slightly thinner, and that kind of gives away what's happening here. So we have a budget knife happening here, okay? And so the liner lock is not super thick, but it's certainly acceptable. And the reality is we shouldn't be using a folding knife in a situation that puts a lot of pressure on the lock. However, consider this. Notice the shape of this blade. I'm going to back off just a little for this part. There we go. Notice the shape of this blade. So when you apply force to the tip, which you would be if you were stabbing something, it's not totally in line with the handle because the handle cants down here, which means in any kind of penetrating motion, you are going to be putting a certain amount of strain on the lock. That's technically true of any folding knife, but the shape of this may slightly increase that. Okay, just kind of to be aware. Now on sort of a counterpoint to that would be that your finger here in this very deep choil does mean that it's going to be nearly impossible for this knife to close on you if you're gripping it hard, which you would be presumably in any kind of combat scenario. Okay, so that's lockup. It is a liner lock, maybe a little thin. Now I want to point out this at this point. This is the second one of these I've had. The first one had to go back to Lansky because not only, so I went to check for blade play, right? I go like this with the knife. I wonder if there's any blade play. Well, I don't feel any blade play, but I feel lock slip. And so as I push, the lock is literally moving over. And I thought, I wonder how hard I'd have to push. So I went like this, pushed a little harder, and the lock completely released, and the knife closed. Not good. So then I thought, well, what about a spine whack? So a very light spine whack, like what I could do on the palm of my hand like this, and guess what? That lock would fail and close. I sent the knife back to Lansky, got this one, and it is fine. Okay, now I'm going to talk about that and a couple other things when I finish with the handle and start talking about general overview type stuff. All right, so let's carry on with deployment. We've talked about lockup, and lockup on this one is fine. It's extremely acceptable, and this liner is thicker than some of the liners I have. Okay, so let's kind of be fair and honest about this and say, it's not that big of a deal that the liner is not very thick. On any other knife at this price point, you would be getting a thinner liner than the one in this most of the time. This liner is about the same thickness as your Rat 1, which, it's good. So although it's not a major complaint, I feel like in a knife of this size and this weight, a slightly thicker liner would have been a nice addition. And I know that probably would have increased cost a little bit. Now, let's get on to deployment, because deployment is actually very good. For a cheap knife, this deploys extremely well. So you've got this flipper mechanism here. It really does a good job. That could be because of the influence of Mikkel Wilhelmsen. Often knife designers, custom knife makers are very good at making flippers. And this one is very good. Doesn't need a lot of force. It flips out very fast. And so that's a real win. And it does what every flipper does, and that is the flipper mechanism becomes a nice finger choil at the front. So that's also good as far as I'm concerned in terms of retention and comfort and all of that stuff. So deployment is very, very good. It's fast, it's smooth, and very effective. By the way, also comfortable. A lot of people complain about some flippers, kind of abrading your finger. There is a little bit of jimping here, but you could flip this open and closed all day, and I think your fingers would be pretty comfortable. All right. So deployment is good. Now the handle. Handle is G10, and I like that they've added a piece of green colored G10 here. The grippiness is quite good. It's not as grippy as a cold steel, but it's good, certainly acceptable. Very comfortable, very ergonomic. You do have this pommel, this sort of impact device on the back, and you could certainly use that in a number of different roles. Breaking a window for sure, breaking someone's skull or other bones would work as well. But you could also use it as a crushing device. If you're breaking open nuts, if you're some kind of wilderness survival task, you can anything that needs to be impacted. This is an impact device, and so it's going to work for that. Okay, and work very well. It's quite well extended past the pommel here, so there's no danger of hurting your hand. And so this is a well done impact device and a well done handle overall. Okay, the handle is very nice. It is G10, which again, how many $30 folding knives are out there? I guess $35 to be fair. $35 folding knives are out there with this type of thick G10 handle scales, right? So very good. The choils are good. Everything is nicely rounded. Even the backspacer here, which is like a big thick hunk of metal, it is comfortable in hand. So that I think is a positive. So the handle is good. The deployment is good. The blade, as I've said, is sort of so-so, and the lockup is acceptable, but maybe could be a little better. Now, let me back off, come back in frame, and talk about sort of the overall impressions that this knife gives. I think in terms of in terms of looks, it's very nice. It looks like a pretty cool blade. If people were over at the house looking at the knife collection, this is one, they'll say, hey, that thing's pretty cool. Where is it from and what is it? And that kind of stuff. On the other hand, what I've experienced myself with the lock and what I've heard from others is that fit and finish can be an issue on these knives, okay? I've heard all kinds of different stories. Screws that are stripped or strip easily. A couple people talked about the stop pin here falling out, and when that does happen, this is the stop pin, so there's nothing to keep the blade from spinning all the way back through the handle. I've heard just a number of sort of fit and finish problems. Okay, so fit and finish seems to be an issue. Now, having said that, if you like the knife, don't let the fit and finish stop you from buying it, because, and you can almost say this about every knife company, if there's an issue, your stop pin does fall out, you can't take the screws out to move the clip, or you strip it when you try to, the lockup doesn't work, or whatever else you could think of that can go wrong in a folding knife, send it back to the company, and I've never heard of a knife company that won't send you a new one. It just doesn't happen. If you send it back, they're going to send you a new one, because it's not good business on their part. Generally, they want to be putting out a good product and want to have a good reputation, and they're going to stand behind what they produce. If it messes up, they're going to fix it, okay? So my experience, and because of maybe the sheer number of knives that I've had quite a number of blades that I've had to send back to different factories for different things, whether it be, Benchmade or, Kershaw, Spyderco, I think, oh yeah, and of course Lansky. I've sent knives back to all those companies. They've all been very good, very fair to deal with, and tried to do their best to fix whatever the problem is and get the knife back, okay? So same with this. Yeah, I've heard of some fit and finish issues, but you can pretty well be sure that if you get one that has an issue, they're going to fix it for you, okay? So overall, this is a cool blade, and I think that's the main reason to buy it. It's not the most practical everyday carry blade at 8 ounces and 9 inches, but it is a nice knife. It is very cool. It is very comfortable. It is very usable. I know I said the blade shape could be a little bit improved, but there's lots of blades that come with that thick, heavy blade stock, and that's totally fine, right? So there you go, YouTube. That's my take on the Lansky X9 Responder. collaboration with Mikkel Williamson. Hope you have a great day, and I hope you enjoyed the video. We'll talk to you soon.